Hey, faithful listener. Thanks for tuning in to the P40 Ministries Daily Podcast. This podcast is dedicated to helping you grow spiritually so you can grow personally. Let's grow together by building a consistent Bible reading routine. This is Jen, your host, and today we will be discussing the book of Mark. Hey, good morning, faithful listeners. Thank you so much for tuning in to the P40 Ministries podcast on this beautiful Tuesday morning. My name is Jen, the host of the P40 Ministries podcast. Once again, thank you for tuning in to share a cup of coffee with me or a cup of tea and to read and discuss the Bible with me. So today we will be talking about Mark chapter 6, verses 45 through 56. Grab your Bible and your cup of hot coffee, and I will be reading out the WEB version as I always do. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he himself sent the multitudes away. After he had taken leave of them, he went up to the mountain to pray. When evening had come, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Seeing them distressed in rowing, for the wind was contrary to them, about the fourth watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea, and he would have passed them by. But they, when they saw him walking on the sea, supposed that it was a ghost, and cried out, for they all saw him and were troubled. But he immediately spoke with them and said to them, "Cheer up, it is I, don't be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were very amazed among themselves and marveled. For they hadn't understood about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. When they crossed over, they came to the land at Gennesaret, and moored to the shore. When they had come out of the boat, immediately the people recognized him, and ran around that whole region, and began to bring those who were sick on their mats to where they heard he was. And wherever he entered, into villages or into cities or into the country, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might just touch the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched were made well. There's a few things about this passage that kind of make me laugh a little bit, and it's specifically about Jesus walking on the water. But let's get to that in a second. So for a quick recap, all the multitudes came to Jesus. He was supposed to be taking a vacation with his disciples and, relaxing with them because they just got back from their really tough journeys, probably for several months, going out by themselves and healing people and preaching and doing whatever, that Jesus knew that everybody needed a break. So they go to this desert area, this wilderness basically, just to chill out for a while. And all of a sudden, all these multitudes are here with Jesus because they saw him going. They saw him probably on the sea. They recognized him. He was a celebrity. So now all of these poor people from all over are running on foot out to this wilderness to meet Jesus and to see him, to hear him, to be healed, whatever else they wanted to do. So it says that Jesus ended up feeding all of them, all the 5,000, with only 5 loaves and with 2 fish. Now, there were probably more than 5,000 because I'm sure there were women and children there. So it was probably closer to 10,000 people, if not more, that Jesus had fed only with a few loaves of bread and with 2 fish. So at this point, the miracle is all done, and now we leave off here on verse 45, which is what we read today, and it says that immediately, right after this is done, after everybody ate everything, and the baskets, were filled, 12 baskets were left over, filled with food, and the disciples gathered all that up. It says that immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and to go ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he himself sent the multitudes away. So the second everybody's done eating and all the leftovers are gathered up into the baskets, he's like, all right, you disciples go into the boat and go to the other side, and I will meet you on the other side in Bethsaida. So they're probably like, how is Jesus without a boat going to meet us in Bethsaida? But of course, Jesus had a special plan here, a really, really fascinating miracle that he was about to perform. While the disciples are getting into the boat, and are well fed, probably taking the baskets left over with them, which, by the way, there were 12 baskets left over and there were 12 disciples. So that's pretty cool that each one of them got a basket to take home. So God was even thinking about the disciples and the disciples' families, because they would have had a ton of food. I mean, a whole basket of leftover food would have lasted them for maybe a week. I don't know, but depending on how many kids or family members they had. But one way or the other, they get into the boat, they probably take the baskets with them, and it says that Jesus at this point sends the multitudes away. So he was like, all right, guys, it's time to go home. You've been fed. It's time for you to sleep. You go home, and I'm going to go pray. It says that the multitudes listened, and they went away. So Jesus goes up to this mountain, because remember, they were in a deserted area. So he goes up to the mountain by himself, and he was praying there. So this would have been probably in the late evening, if not already the nighttime. So Jesus is going up to the mountain to pray by himself because he needs that time with his Father. He needs that time to just rest and relax. Some of my most restful times is after I wake up in the morning. I like to sit out on my porch if it's nice outside and just sit there and read and, pray. It's one of my favorite times of the day. I really enjoy doing it. It's very restful and relaxing, and I get to go outside and enjoy the breeze and the nature and the wind and the butterflies and whatever else is outside, and then I pray. And that's kind of a very peaceful thing that I've been doing. I've noticed, unfortunately, I'm not very consistent with my personal Bible reading. People always think, because she is, doing a Bible podcast, she's probably always, doing personal reading. No, it's not a laughing matter, but honestly, I'm really bad at personal reading. So thankfully, I've gotten myself a little bit more into a routine where I've been sitting out on my porch every day that I can, that it's nice outside, and reading my Bible. And plus I got myself a cute little devotional book. But anyway, that had nothing to do with this this passage of scripture. But anyway, Jesus is going up to the mountain to pray, to get that rest and relaxation that he needs, that can only come from his daily prayers with his Father. And I think my point was, I have felt much more peaceful, much more relaxed, much less anxious ever since I've also gotten into a routine of sitting outside and, drinking my coffee and reading the Bible and, praying and stuff like that. So there is an amount of rest and relaxation that comes from that alone. And so Jesus is taking advantage of that since he has this alone time. So then it says, when evening had come, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. And seeing them distressed in rowing, for the wind was contrary to them, about the fourth watch of the night, he came out to them walking on the sea. So it's kind of funny. So it says that evening was already there. Jesus was up on the mountain. He was completely alone. He was praying. And this just shows right here that Jesus is in fact God, because he was able to see them in the middle of the night out on the sea. How many miles away? I don't know. And then plus on top of that, it's pitch dark outside and there's a storm happening. Jesus could see them rowing on the sea. That's impossible for a human being to do, especially that late at night when it's that dark outside. And think about how there was no light pollution back in those days. The disciples didn't have any lights, I'm sure. Jesus didn't have any lights, I'm sure. And there was no lights coming from the city. Jesus was in the middle of a wilderness. I mean, it was pitch dark outside. So this right here just shows that there's something special about Jesus, that he's not just a man, that he's able to see in the pitch black middle of the night his disciples rowing. So he knew about them. He knew what was happening there and about this storm and everything. So it says that, I don't know how much of a storm this was, but it was dark outside. It was 3:00 in the morning. It says the fourth watch. So it would have been around 2 or 3 in the morning. And the wind and the waves were contrary. In other words, they were opposite of the disciples. So the disciples were trying to row to get to Bethsaida, and the waves had another idea and were trying to give the disciples some trouble and push them the other way. So Jesus sees this and he starts walking out onto the sea, and he would have passed them by. So this is the part that makes me laugh so hard. It's just like Jesus is like playing a practical joke on his disciples. And probably not really, but it's sort of just funny. So he's just like walking out on the sea and he's just gonna like pass them by. So finally, the disciples see Jesus like out on the sea. And I don't know how close Jesus was to them. Probably pretty close because they could hear him talking. So he couldn't have been that far away. So they finally see him and they are so freaked out, the disciples. They're just like, what is that? And they think it's a ghost, okay? So they're so out of their mind, afraid, and they're screaming and they're like, it's a ghost, it's a ghost. And they're crying out, for they all saw him, they said, and they were all very troubled. I mean, imagine if you saw somebody walking on the sea. Like, that's impossible. That's absolutely impossible. You wouldn't think you'd think you were seeing visions, right? Because it's impossible for somebody to walk out on the sea. But obviously it's not impossible for Jesus because he is God. And it's cool that Jesus keeps showing his disciples in particular how he is God, right? The multitudes didn't necessarily get to see. They didn't get to see Jesus calming the storms and, Jesus walking out on the sea. This was reserved for the 12 disciples who would be the ones to build the church. And the foundation, of course, would be on Jesus Christ. And so the disciples were the ones that got to see these really incredulous, crazy, powerful miracles that Jesus was doing, because the disciples were the ones that were going to continue on with Jesus's work and exclaim to the entire world that Jesus was in fact God. So that's kind of my point with that. So it says here that he saw that they were all scared, and so he immediately spoke with them, because who knows, they would have capsized in their fear. And so he says to them, cheer up, it is I. So he's like, it's me, it's Jesus. Don't be afraid. And he's like, I can walk on the sea. Don't be afraid. So then it says he got into the boat with them and the wind ceased and they were very amazed among themselves and they marveled. Okay, so that's the other thing that makes me laugh here. Mark completely leaves out that Peter unsuccessfully walked on the water as well. And if you heard my first episode in Mark, when I was talking a little bit about this book, you would have heard that Mark was kind of a assistant to Peter, or a protege or something like that. Mark and John Mark and Peter were very close. So Mark would have been hearing all of Peter's stories. So it is kind of funny that he leaves out that Peter walked on the water, but also it's mentioned in another book of the Bible, but I can't remember which one. But Peter did walk on the water. We find that out. And he kind of unsuccessfully did because, he started out okay. He did walk on the water. And halfway to Jesus, he starts seeing all these waves coming at him. And he gets so afraid that he immediately begins to sink. So as he's sinking, he screams out, Lord, help me. And Jesus takes Peter's hand and lifts him up and then brings him back into the boat. Actually, we might have talked about that in the book of Matthew, now that I'm thinking about it. So, Peter, even though he began to sink, and it was kind of his own fault, right? He lost his faith. He screamed out immediately, Jesus, help me, Lord, help me. And that is what we need to do when we make mistakes, is even though we purposefully make mistakes sometimes, or even accidentally, Jesus is so merciful that even when we make mistakes, that if we call out to him, Jesus, help me, he will help us. So that's what I think is really cool about Peter and about Peter's mistakes, that he was, even though he often got into trouble and often made trouble for himself, he was so good at being humble and being like, I messed up. Please forgive me. Please help me. So that's the really, really cool thing about Peter. And, it's funny because I kind of relate, I think, the most with Peter out of anybody in the New Testament, I relate very strongly with Peter because I'm always making so many mistakes. And I'm kind of a people pleaser myself. And, there's tons of evidence that Peter was a people pleaser and was very afraid. And even Peter's background a little bit is very, what's the word I'm looking for? His background is very legalistic is what I was going to say. And so is mine. So I think it's kind of cool. I just sort of relate to Peter. But anyway, this isn't mentioned here in Mark, but it says that Jesus did get into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were very amazed among themselves and marveled, for they hadn't understood about the loaves because their hearts were hardened. So what a weird thing for Mark to add in there. They didn't understand Jesus's miraculous miracle of feeding the 5,000 people. Their hearts were hardened because of it. So maybe they were just so happy about, or maybe they were just so prideful, they were so happy about Jesus getting all this attention and, them being in Jesus's presence and able to speak directly to him. And they see, Jesus doing this incredulous miracle, and their hearts are hardened with pride. We often see that pride is what causes a hard heart, because Jesus is always talking about the Pharisees and how they have a hard heart and how they are so prideful. It looks to me like the disciples became prideful over Jesus, doing that miracle with the 5,000 people and the loaves of bread. So now they're marveling at Jesus and they're amazed because of Jesus, because they're seeing him now as God. They're seeing him as God, and their hearts were hardened through the miracle with the 5,000 people. But anyway, it says here that when they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored to the shore. So they were a little far off from Bethsaida, it looks like. So they landed in Gennesaret. So then after this, it says that they had come out of the boat, and the people immediately recognized Jesus, and they ran around that region. So they came from all over the different regions, and they came to Gennesaret to see Jesus, and they were bringing their sick people to him wherever they heard he was. It didn't matter if he was in the villages, it didn't matter if he was in the city, it didn't matter if he was in the wilderness or the country. They all came to see Jesus. So Jesus didn't get a break. I mean, the entire thing here in Mark chapter 6 is talking about how much Jesus needed a break but didn't get one, kind of, because he tried to get a break but could not originally, and then now unable to get a break here in Gennesaret. So it says here, everywhere from all over, people were coming to Jesus, and they were begging him that they might just touch the fringe of his garment, and as many as touched him were made well. And we know from the story of the woman with the issue of blood, that power, in fact, does go out of Jesus whenever somebody is healed. So I can't even imagine how draining this was on Jesus himself, but yet he allowed every single person to touch the fringe of his garment, as that woman with the issue of blood did. And, even though it would have been draining for Jesus to do this and probably very tiring, he allowed the people who were sick to come to him and to touch him. So I think that's a very important thing to recognize, is that Jesus was in fact a servant. When we see him in the New Testament and all these great miracles that he does, we forget how much of a servant he was, and how stressful his job would have really been to just not get any break, not get any rest, barely get any food. We talked about on last Thursday how Jesus ate last. He fed everybody else before he was able to eat. So Jesus was in fact a servant, and since Jesus is our greatest model, we are supposed to serve other people in the same capacity that Jesus did, even though it might be draining for us. I can't remember who says it. Maybe it was Peter or James, but it says, don't become tired of doing good for other people, because that's what Jesus did. Even though Jesus was in fact tired, he didn't get tired of doing good. He was always doing good, and we should as well. But friends, this was Mark chapter 6, verses 45 through 56. Thanks for tuning in to this episode. And friends, I have a brand new fall design in my t-shirt shop, so please navigate over there and take a look at it because it's really cute. It has some pumpkins on it, and I think it says give thanks or always give thanks or something like that. I don't even remember my own designs, so you'll have to look at it for me and remind me what it is when you purchase one for a friend or family member. But I'll drop a link to that in the bio of this podcast episode. Friends and faithful listeners, have a fantastic rest of your day. Happy listening, and God bless.